Well, hello everyone. This is Fadi, and I want to welcome you to another episode of this fascinating video series that we're doing with Brother Mel concerning the holes in the narrative and why the standard Islamic narrative is sketchy. We've covered a number of sketchy, basically elements that are associated with the standard Islamic narrative, and we've shown evidence that it's either originated somewhere else or actually does not fit what the standard Islamic narrative is trying to prove as far as the originality of those elements or components when it comes to Islam. Today we're going to talk about another one of those standard Islamic narrative components, and that's the idea of the successive masjids or mosques on the Temple Mount. And with that, of course, we need to turn our attention to our brother Mel, who will undoubtedly help us dissect and unpack this. Brother, welcome back.
Well, great to be back. In the last episode, we looked at the evidence for why I believe the Masjid al-Haram was in Jerusalem. So a good place to go from there is to look at when and where the first masjid was built by Umar, and what happened after that, and how did we end up with the Dome of the Rock. So I think this is an interesting area to explore. So without further ado, in 636, 637, we have Umar's entry into Jerusalem. And it's interesting that one of the first things that he did on conquering Jerusalem was that he set about building this key masjid. Now, this standard Islamic narrative would tell you that Jerusalem is third in importance in terms of Islam. But what's interesting is that in itself is a distortion of what the case was in the 7th century. So in the earliest days, actually, Jerusalem was the jewel, was the prize that they sought. It was number one. It was the most important place. We still see echoes of that importance of Jerusalem in the idea that Muhammad flew on the horse to Jerusalem and ascended into heaven and so on. That kind of echoes that importance of Jerusalem. It's interesting that Muhammad doesn't ascend into heaven from Mecca, where you'd think he would, but instead from Jerusalem. And that's kind of just one of those anomalies that's still there in the standard Islamic narrative, which no one got around to getting rid of. But in any case, if we look at the history of the Temple Mount, it's interesting that there was another attempt to build a new temple back in 363. This attempt was done by the Roman Emperor Julian. And this attempt ended in failure and was marked by divine displeasure. And just a quote here from the ecclesiastical history of Sosomen, he says, "Although the pagans were not well disposed towards the Jews, yet they assisted them in this enterprise because they reckoned upon its ultimate success," and here is really important, "and hoped by this means to falsify the prophecies of Christ." So the prophecy of Christ that was key is the fact that there would be no new temple on this location. The Jews, I believe, he says, were just in this state for instead of regarding this unexpected earthquake as a manifest indication that God was opposed to the re-erection of their temple, they processed to recommence the work, but all parties relate that they had scarcely returned to the undertaking when fire burst from the foundations of the temple and consumed several of the workmen. This fact is fearlessly stated and believed by all. The only discrepancy in the narrative is that some maintain that fire burst from the interior of the temple as the workmen were striving to force the entrance, while others say the fire proceeded direct from the bowels of the earth. So what we're talking about here is that there was an attempt to rebuild the temple, and there were a series of natural and what seems to be miraculous events that seemed to hinder their attempt to rebuild the temple, and they abandoned the effort. So this is centuries before Islam, and Christians would have viewed this as a divine sign that an attempt to thwart Jesus' prophecies were overruled by God's miraculous powers. Okay, so in this context, any attempt really to build on the Temple Mount has got an anti-Christian element to it, I would argue, because it's partly to disprove Jesus's prophecies. There's no inclination among Christians to rebuild the temple, because this is something that is no longer necessary, because the church itself is the new temple. So it's a regressive thing. So if we look at 638 then, the Arabs attempted to build their Masjid al-Haram on this same location. If we take this reference here, which I think I can't remember where I got this from. I think this was from Robert Hoyland's book. But John Moscus, the Pratum Spiritual, the Spiritual Meadow, 7th century. Narratives 18 and 19 of this appendix concern Sophronius in his position of Patriarch of Jerusalem and are recounted on the authority of a contemporary of his, the Archdeacon Theodore. Number 19 tells us how the godless Saracens entered the holy city of Christ our Lord, Jerusalem, with the permission of God and in punishment for our negligence, which is considerable, and immediately proceeded in haste to the place which is called the capital. They took with them men, some by force, others by their own will, in order to clean that place and to build that cursed thing intended for their prayer and which they call a masjid. Sophronius excommunicated an archdeacon called John, a skilled marble worker, who did work on this building for pay. Likely this occurred in 638 AD. Okay, so this group of Saracens, they set about building this building, and they probably thought that this is it. Now we have won the day. But later there was an earthquake. So Umar's masjid was destroyed by an earthquake in 659 AD. The monk Anastasius of Sinai informs us that he had witnessed clearing work being undertaken on the Temple Mount circa 660. Now on Friday, the 7th of June, 659, there was a violent earthquake in Palestine and many places were collapsed. Very likely the Mosque of Umar was one of the edifices affected, and it was therefore incumbent upon Muawiyah to have the structure rebuilt. That both Umar and Muawiyah undertook building projects on the Temple Mount is confirmed by certain of our sources. And this is the bit that came from Robert Hoyland. Now, what's interesting is you would think that having had an earthquake destroy this masjid, which was, if we were to take the standard Islamic narrative, it was just one masjid among many. But this masjid seems to be seriously important because they didn't delay in rebuilding it. Straight after the earthquake, they got to work, put in a lot of resources into rebuilding this masjid. But even then, this wasn't enough for them. Abdul al-Malik thought to himself, this is not sufficient. We need to up the ante and make an even greater, more beautiful masjid on this site. Now, before we get to that point, we have a piece of evidence from a pilgrim who visited the site in 670, so about 10 years after it was rebuilt by Muawiyah. A French bishop called Arculf, who had been on pilgrimage to Jerusalem, got shipwrecked off the coast of Britain, and his account was recorded in Abdomnan's writings, who was an Irish monk, in 700 AD at Iona. And it says, in that famous place where once stood the magnificently constructed temple near the eastern wall, the Saracens now frequent a rectangular house of prayer, which they have built in a crude manner, constructing it from raised planks and large beams over some remains of ruins. This house can, as it is said, accommodate at least 3,000 people. So I would argue that all of this evidence points to the Masjid al-Haram being this place. They're putting an awful lot of effort into making sure that they have this masjid right smack in the middle of Jerusalem on Mount Moriah or Mount Marwa. So very important place. And I just pointed out that the area of this would have been about the size of an American football field I'm sure our American audience will be able to relate to the size from that. Now, in 692, the Dome of the Rock was built by Abdul al-Malik. It is unclear whether it was commenced or completed in that year, but it was built in an octagonal shape, which for the Byzantines was associated with baptism and mausoleums. So that's quite curious why they built it in that shape. But in any case, if we look at the timeline, Umar builds it in 638 to 640, so in that time frame. An earthquake destroys it in 659. Muawiyah builds a new one in 660. And then Abdul al-Malik builds the Dome of the Rock in 692. So as you can see, there's an awful lot of money and effort being put into this specific masjid. Why is that? I would argue that it's because this was the Masjid al-Haram in the 7th century, and this is on the eve of the movement of the masjid way down to Mecca in probably the next century. And it's interesting, we have a reference to the Odyssey of Mecca as the place of the Masjid al-Haram, because he ridicules it in his writings and says, well, where are the trees for the sacrifice of Isaac in that location? He basically mocks the new site of Mecca, because the old site made sense, because this was the station of Abraham originally, where it made sense. It's now moved to a new site and lost its biblical connection.
Now, is there any connection between this earthquake and also the destruction of Petra, for instance?
Not that I'm aware of. The earthquake that was in Petra happened in 713, though I know there were a number of earthquakes over the centuries. So, in terms of the one in 713, would that have damaged the Dome of the Rock as well? Could have been. I don't know what the answer to that one is. It'd be worth inquiring.
What about the revolt of Ibn Zubayr and the taking of the Black Stone, for instance? Is there any connection or correlation to the destruction of this particular masjid and that?
Yeah, I have a feeling that when it talks about Abdul al-Zubayr, that this might be conflict around Jerusalem and not Petra, as argued by Dan Gibson. So I kind of have a disagreement on that one. I did look into all the different references to that dispute, but the evidence is very thin, and I didn't come to any conclusions on that one. Okay. But certainly the idea of there being an army there involved in the conflict, it would make sense if it's in relation to the army that was guarding the Temple Mount, for example. I can't remember the exact reference, but I remember having read the text, it seemed like it could make sense in relation to the Temple Mount to me. But as I say, it's a bit sketchy. There's not a lot of evidence there. In terms of I think it was in Al-Tabari that it's referred to. I didn't see any evidence of a rock being moved in Al-Tabari that I could find, at least. So I don't know where Dan Gibson got those conclusions about the movement of the rock. So I couldn't say anything more on it than that.
Well, wonderful, brother. Thank you so much. This is, I believe, video number 6 in this series. We still have a few more to go. Hopefully everyone has been enjoying this. Please remember to send your comments or observations to us. Connect with me if you like, or connect with our brother through his channel, Sneakers Corner, and ask us questions about what you are watching, or even bring to our attention anything you would like us to inquire about. I know many of you have been reaching out to me sometimes after watching the series, whether with Mel or with Jay, and they ask questions about certain things they've been observing, or maybe they came from a culture like in India or somewhere. They're noticing, familiar phrases or familiar practices, and they're inquiring about that as well. Undoubtedly, there is some overlap in different areas, but there is also a reason why you see this, because it originated somewhere, and people sometimes emotionally, when they migrate from one area to the other or move from one area to the other, whether for political reasons, whether for national disaster, whether just by choice, they are so emotionally attached to things that they are familiar with, and it's quite possible that they have, revived that again and started it something to remind them basically of what took place in the past, or maybe where they migrated from. I use, for example, the idea of New England, for instance, in the United States. That's because they moved from England, the Pilgrims, and they wanted to start in a new England, if you wish. There is New York, there is New Jersey. I mean, you get the idea of what's going on. So there is, there is no problem here. The fact that Mecca today became that hub, but the issue, was it the original place for it? And that's what we are trying to tackle. Well, brother, next time, looks like we are going to talk about the Masjid al-Haram never existed in Petra. And we like to address that. Again, I want to clarify, our brother is not talking about the Qibla issue. He's talking about the Kaaba, for instance, or the Holy Mosque in general. Was it in Petra also, or was it in Jerusalem? I want to point out to you, and you've heard it from Jay probably many times, and also from Mel and others, or Odom, for instance. There is two theories that are taking place. One is called the Petra thesis, and one is called the Jerusalem thesis. Regardless of where you stand on either one of those theses, there is something interesting in there that points to elements that contradict the standard Islamic narrative. And hence, this is why we're calling this the holes in the narrative, why the standard Islamic narrative is sketchy. Thank you, brother, as always. Thank you, everyone, for watching us. And until we meet again next time for another episode, have a blessed day. Thank you for watching this video. Be sure to like and subscribe to our channel, CIRA International, and click on the bell so that you receive notifications whenever we publish a new video or go live. I would also like to appeal to you to consider becoming a Patreon patron by clicking the link right below. By doing so, you can give towards the production of these videos. There are also other options for you where you can give to our channel. I thank you from the bottom of my heart.